There is a pattern that shows up every single time two people are truly meant to be in each other's lives, and it looks nothing like what most of us were taught to expect. Growing up, many of us quietly inherit a soft illusion about love, one that is polished by stories, films, and carefully edited memories of other people's relationships. We are taught, often without anyone explicitly saying it, that real love should feel like arrival, like recognition without confusion, like peace that requires no adjustment. The right person, we imagine, will step into our life and suddenly the noise will settle. Everything will click into place with minimal effort, like two pieces of a puzzle finally discovering they were always shaped for each other. But lived experience rarely follows that script. Real connection does not arrive as a finished harmony. It begins more like interference. Something in you shifts first, often before you even understand what has changed. A disruption enters your emotional landscape and quietly rearranges the familiar order of things. It does not feel comforting at the beginning. In fact, it often feels slightly unsettling, as if something stable inside you has been nudged out of its long-held position. You cannot immediately name what is happening, but you feel it in the way your attention starts returning to one person more than expected, or in the way your emotional responses become sharper, more alive, more unpredictable. This is where real connection begins, not in ease, but in friction that reveals depth. Because ease, while comforting, does not always expose anything new about you. It allows you to remain unchanged, unchallenged, safely repeating what you already know about yourself. But disruption does something different. It interrupts the scripts you have been living by. It creates small internal collisions between what you thought you wanted and what you are now feeling, between what you believed you needed and what is actually awakening in you. And in those collisions, something begins to surface that was previously dormant. This is why meaningful relationships often feel like they destabilize you before they stabilize you. When you meet someone who genuinely reaches into your emotional interior, they do not just offer comfort, they activate areas of you that were previously quiet. Sometimes that activation feels like warmth, but just as often it feels like uncertainty. You begin to notice parts of yourself that were not part of your everyday awareness. Your attachment patterns become more visible. Your fears become more articulate. Your desire for closeness starts to conflict with your fear of being seen too deeply. You are no longer simply living your emotional life. You are observing it unfold in real time. And that observation can feel like turbulence. We often misunderstand this turbulence as a sign that something is wrong. We assume that if love is real, it should not feel confusing. But confusion is often the byproduct of encountering something that does not fit neatly into your existing emotional framework. When someone matters to you in a way that exceeds your usual expectations, your internal system has to recalibrate. And recalibration is rarely smooth. It is a process of adjustment that includes resistance, hesitation, and moments of emotional contradiction. At times you may feel deeply drawn to someone and simultaneously unsure of why that pull exists. You may feel comforted by their presence but also strangely exposed by it. You may want closeness and distance at the same time, not because you are inconsistent, but because something real is activating multiple layers of your emotional architecture all at once. And the same thing happens in them, though not always in the same way or at the same speed. This is why early connection often feels unstable. It is not because it is false, but because it is unfinished. Two inner worlds are adjusting to each other, and neither has yet settled into a predictable rhythm. In that space, people often mistake intensity for incompatibility or interpret emotional activation as a warning sign rather than a sign of depth. But disruption is not the opposite of love. It is often the entry point into it. What gets shaken loose in these experiences is not just emotion, but perception. You start seeing yourself differently through the reflection of another person. You notice how you respond when you care. You become aware of your patterns of pursuit, withdrawal, overthinking, idealization, or fear. Love, in its more honest form, has a way of revealing these patterns without asking permission. It does not do so to punish you, but to make you conscious of what was previously automatic. and that consciousness can feel uncomfortable. Because once you see yourself more clearly, you cannot entirely return to the version of you that existed before that awareness. Something has been added to your internal understanding, and it changes how you relate not only to the other person, but to yourself. You begin to realize that love is not simply about finding someone who fits you effortlessly, but about encountering someone who reveals parts of you that were waiting to be seen. This is where the fantasy of effortless love begins to break down. Not because ease never exists, but because ease is not the foundation. It is something that sometimes arrives later, after understanding has replaced confusion, after two emotional systems have learned how to move without colliding constantly. Real connection often earns its ease over time. It is not given at the beginning as a guarantee. And in that early stage, where disruption is most present, people often make one of two mistakes. They either chase intensity, believing confusion equals fate, or they retreat from it entirely, believing discomfort equals incompatibility. Both responses miss something essential, that emotional activation is not inherently a signal to proceed or to stop. It is a signal to pay attention, to look more closely, to understand what exactly is being stirred inside you. Because love that is meaningful will always stir something. It will not leave you unchanged. It will not allow you to remain entirely within the boundaries of your previous emotional habits. It will stretch perception. It will test assumptions. It will sometimes make you feel more alive and more uncertain at the same time. And that duality is not a flaw in the experience. It is often the sign that something real is being formed. Over time, if the connection is healthy and both people are willing to engage with what is being revealed, that initial disruption can soften. It can evolve into something steadier, something that no longer feels like internal noise, but like shared understanding. But that stability is built, not discovered, fully formed. It is shaped through communication, presence, accountability, and emotional willingness from both sides. Without that work, disruption remains disruption. With it, disruption becomes transformation. So the idea that love should begin as ease is not only incomplete, it is misleading. It prepares us to misunderstand some of the most meaningful experiences we may ever have. Because often, the people who matter most to us are not the ones who arrive quietly and neatly into our lives, but the ones who unsettle something within us that was ready, perhaps without our awareness, to be awakened. And once that awakening begins, nothing remains exactly as it was before. The universe does not deliver the right person to you wrapped in comfort. It delivers them wrapped in challenge. And that challenge is not a mistake. It is the whole point. When you meet someone who is truly meant to play a significant role in your life, the first thing you usually feel is not peace. It is a strange, unsettling kind of recognition. Something in you responds to them before your mind has caught up. You cannot quite explain it. It is not necessarily romantic electricity or instant warmth. It is more like something being disturbed within you, something quiet and buried suddenly becoming visible. That feeling is uncomfortable because this person, without even trying, is reflecting back the parts of you that you have spent years avoiding, the fears you have learned to work around, the insecurities you have gotten good at hiding, the patterns you have repeated without ever really examining them. Most people interpret that discomfort as a sign that something is wrong. They pull back, they rationalize, they talk themselves out of it. But that discomfort is often the clearest sign that something deeply right is happening, something that demands more from you than you have been willing to give before. One of the most confusing things about these kinds of connections is that they almost never stay together at the start. There is always some form of separation. Circumstances change, timing gets complicated, one or both people are simply not ready. And from the outside, or even from inside the experience, it can feel cruel, like something meaningful is being taken away just as it was beginning. But that separation is rarely random. It happens because at least one person, and usually both, is carrying unresolved weight, old wounds that have not been dealt with, a fear of real emotional openness, a fragile sense of self-worth that is not yet steady enough to hold real love without distorting it. When two people who are still incomplete in these ways come together, even with the best intentions, they tend to hurt each other. Not out of malice, but out of unhealed places. So there is a kind of pause, a pulling apart. And within that pause, something important begins. The pain of this kind of separation is not like ordinary heartbreak. Ordinary heartbreak is about loss. This kind of pain is about recognition. You do not just miss the person. You feel their absence as though something essential has been removed, as though a part of your own development has been interrupted. That is because, in a real sense, it has. These connections are not just about companionship. They are about the growth that only becomes possible when a specific person enters your life and holds up a mirror to who you actually are. The separation forces you to sit with what that mirror showed you, the fears of being abandoned, the habit of giving too much of yourself in hopes of being chosen, the places where you accepted less than you deserved because you were afraid that asking for more would drive people away. These things become impossible to ignore when the distraction of the relationship itself is gone. And that exposure, as painful as it is exactly what needs to happen. What is remarkable is that even without contact, even in silence, growth begins. Quietly and without fanfare, you start to change. The things you once tolerated begin to feel wrong. The people you used to chase no longer hold the same pull. You find yourself wanting something more real, more honest, more substantial. The superficial things that used to satisfy you stop being enough. You are not always consciously aware of why this is happening. You might not connect it to them at all. But the shift began the moment they entered your life, and it continues even in their absence. You find yourself thinking of them sometimes not out of loneliness or desperation, but during the quiet moments. During a period of honest reflection, during a breakthrough, during those still late nights when everything feels clear and a little raw. That is not obsession, that is integration. Their presence in your life, however brief or complicated, is weaving itself into your understanding of yourself. And through that, you are slowly becoming someone different, someone more honest, more self-aware, more capable of the kind of love that actually lasts. People will try to replace this kind of connection. They move into new relationships, fill their time, tell themselves they have moved on. And sometimes that works for a while, but there is often this quiet incompleteness that lingers, not because the new people lack value, but because they do not activate the same depth of growth. Destined connections operate on a different frequency entirely. They are not just about feeling good with someone. They are about being transformed by someone, about having the parts of yourself you have been carrying in the dark finally brought into the light. During the time apart, both people are quietly doing their work, whether they realize it or not. One learns how to hold healthy limits. The other learns to take emotional responsibility. One builds genuine self-respect for the first time. The other finds the courage to actually feel things instead of running from them. One stops chasing what cannot be controlled. The other stops hiding from what must be faced. Neither can see the full picture while this is happening. And that is by design. The understanding comes later, once both people have grown enough to hold it. Before any real reunion can take place, certain things have to be dismantled. False beliefs about love have to go. The idea that real love is always easy. The belief that if someone cared enough, they would never leave. The feeling that you have to earn love through performance or sacrifice. The sense that you need another person to feel whole. These are not truths, they are distortions, built from old pain and fear, and they make genuine connection impossible. Destiny, if we want to call it that, works by dismantling these things slowly, often through discomfort, often through heartbreak, often through the very moments that feel like nothing is going right. Every difficult moment, when seen from within it, rarely feels purposeful. It feels like delay, like confusion, like emotional noise that refuses to settle into clarity. Yet there is a quieter layer beneath that surface experience, one that becomes visible only when you are no longer completely inside the storm. From that slightly more distant vantage point, something else begins to reveal itself. Not that pain is pleasant, and not that suffering is desirable, but that certain inner processes only unfold through friction. Some emotional truths do not arrive through insight alone. They arrive through experience that strips away what is unsustainable. Every tear, every stretch of longing, every night where time feels heavier than it should, carries a kind of internal function. Not in a romanticized sense, not as a justification for hurt, but as a process of reorganization. Human beings are constantly building internal narratives about who they are, what they need, and how love is supposed to feel. Many of those narratives are inherited, some are imagined, and many are based on partial experiences that were never fully examined. When a difficult emotional period begins, those narratives are no longer left untouched. They start to bend under pressure. And what bends under pressure reveals its structure. In that sense, emotional difficulty acts like a form of internal separation. It begins to distinguish between what is deeply aligned with your emotional reality and what was only ever loosely attached to it. There are feelings, beliefs, expectations, and attachments that appear stable during calm periods, but begin to loosen when tested. The discomfort you feel is often not just about loss or uncertainty. It is also about the loosening of structures you had assumed were permanent. This is where the idea of clearing out the false begins to make psychological sense. The false does not always appear as something obviously wrong. Often it appears as something that once felt meaningful but no longer fits the person you are becoming. It can be an attachment that was built on potential rather than reality. It can be a version of love that depended more on imagination than mutual presence. It can be the belief that if you try hard enough, understand deeply enough, or wait long enough, something will eventually transform into what you hoped it would be. When emotional difficulty arrives, it tests those beliefs not with argument, but with experience. Longing, for example, is not just missing someone. It is the amplification of desire in the absence of resolution. It stretches attention towards something that is not currently returning that attention in the same form. In doing so, it forces you to confront a gap between what you want and what is actually available. That gap can feel unbearable at times, but it also contains information. It reveals the difference between emotional investment and emotional reciprocity, between attachment and mutual presence, between hope and reality. And in that gap, clarity begins to form. Tears, similarly, are not simply emotional overflow. They are often the release of internal tension that has accumulated when something within you can no longer be held in its previous shape. They can mark the moment where resistance softens, where denial stops holding its structure, where something you were trying to manage internally without fully acknowledging finally becomes undeniable enough to feel. In that sense, tears are not weakness, they are transition. They often appear when an internal narrative begins to break apart. And night, with its quiet and reduced external distraction, tends to intensify all of this. During the day, attention is scattered. You are anchored in tasks, interactions, and external structure. But at night, the internal world becomes louder. Thoughts that were previously manageable become more pronounced. Questions that were previously postponed begin to surface. This is why longing often feels strongest in silence. Not because the feeling is new, but because there is finally space for it to be fully perceived. In those moments, the mind tries to make meaning. It replays conversations, imagines alternatives, revisits memories, searches for resolution. And through that repetition, something important happens. The emotional truth of the situation becomes harder to avoid, not because the mind has solved it, but because it has fully encountered it. This is how clearing begins. Clearing is not an immediate process. It does not remove feelings instantly. Instead, it gradually reduces the power of illusions that depend on avoidance. For example, the illusion that absence will automatically turn into return. The illusion that silence always contains hidden communication. The illusion that intensity alone guarantees connection. These beliefs often persist when reality is not fully faced. But emotional difficulty brings repeated contact with reality in its raw form, without the comforting edits that hope tends to apply. And slowly, what cannot hold its shape begins to dissolve. What remains after this dissolution is not emptiness, but something more accurate. You begin to see the relationship, the person, and yourself with less distortion. This can feel painful because distortion often protects desire. It allows things to feel more aligned than they actually are. But it also prevents clarity. And clarity, while sometimes difficult, is what allows real choice. When false expectations are cleared away, space is created. Space for understanding what is actually present rather than what was imagined. Space for recognizing patterns that repeat rather than hoping for exceptions that may never come. Space for seeing whether a connection is truly reciprocal or whether it is sustained mostly through internal effort on one side. This is why difficult emotional periods often precede major shifts in life direction. Not because suffering itself is the goal, but because certain realizations require the removal of noise. And noise is often emotional attachment that has not yet been resolved. When that noise becomes too heavy to maintain, something gives way. And in that giving way, insight appears. It is also important to understand that this clearing does not always lead to loss. Sometimes it leads to redefinition. Some connections survive clarity and become stronger because they are no longer built on confusion. They are rebuilt on honesty, on mutual understanding, on realistic expectation rather than idealized projection. In those cases, difficulty becomes a passage into something more grounded. But even when a connection does not continue, the clearing still serves a function. It returns you to yourself without the layers of distortion that made you question your own perception. It restores internal alignment. It reduces the tendency to abandon your own needs in order to preserve uncertainty. It brings you back into contact with what feels consistent within you rather than what feels unstable outside of you. Over time, what once felt like emotional chaos begins to reveal itself as reorganization. Not immediate, not clean, not always gentle, but directional. A movement away from what cannot sustain you toward what can. And the path is not always linear. It involves revisiting feelings, re-experiencing memories, and sitting with uncertainty longer than you would prefer. But beneath all of that, something is shifting into place. So when seen from within the moment, difficulty feels like confusion. But when seen in retrospect, it often appears as refinement. A slow stripping away of what was never fully aligned, until what remains is something truer, simpler, and more capable of holding your emotional reality without distortion. And in that sense, nothing meaningful is wasted. Even what hurts has been participating in the process of making things clearer than they were before. There comes a point, usually quietly and without much ceremony, when you stop needing them. Not in a cold or detached way, but in a free way. You are no longer loving from a place of scarcity or fear. You are no longer chasing or desperate or running calculations about whether they will come back. You have become someone who can stand fully on their own. And that is the moment when everything shifts. When love stops being a survival mechanism and starts being a genuine choice, the conditions for real connection finally exist. When two people who have done this work find their way back to each other, it feels completely different from before. The tension is largely gone. The games and confusion that used to define things have dissolved. What remains is something calmer, clearer, and far more grounded. It is not perfect, but it is intentional. There is a recognition that is deeper now because it is being met with two people who actually know themselves, who have faced their fears, who are choosing each other from wholeness rather than need. And yet, not every connection is meant to end in reunion. Some are meant to break patterns that have followed you for years. Some exist to wake up your sense of self-worth after it has been dormant for too long. Some are there to redirect the entire course of your life. Their value is not in permanence. Their value is in transformation, and in that sense, they always fulfill their purpose, regardless of whether the two people end up together. If you are sitting with someone on your mind right now, let these words settle for a moment. If it is meant to come back, it will do so calmly. It will not arrive demanding that you abandon yourself or shrink yourself or prove your worth. It will arrive as an invitation to grow further. And if it does not come back, that outcome is also meaningful. It is guiding you towards something, toward a version of yourself that is more whole, more honest, and more ready for the love that is actually aligned with who you are becoming. Nothing in this process is wasted. Not the pain, not the distance, not the confusion, not the silence. All of it is part of a preparation that is far more precise than it appears. Destiny, if it exists at all, is not sentimental. It is not interested in your comfort in the short term. It is interested in your depth over the long one, and the love it moves you toward, whether with this person or eventually someone else, is the kind that is built on something real. Something that can actually hold the weight of two full, honest, evolving human beings. That is the love worth waiting for. And you are being shaped for it right now, even when it does not feel that way.